Hey everybody, welcome back to another lecture. Today we will be going over Chapter 40, Incident Management. If you are in an EMT course anywhere around the country, I don't know all of the state's requirements, but here locally in Idaho, we do require the incident command trainings through FEMA to be included in the course. So that's usually where a lot of this is covered. Just for your information, you may need to get a certification on this depending on what course you're in. However, kind of a silver lining is that is a lifetime certification. So once you get it, hold on to it, save it somewhere, you'll never lose it, and you never got to do these again, okay? But it is great information to brush up on because these are things that you will run into, and these are very high stress situations. So let's get going. Okay, so disasters, mass casualties, MCIs, mass casualty incidents, can be overwhelming. So an MCI, to meet the MCI criteria, there needs to be 3 or more patients. Now it says lack of resources there. That's more of the thing you need to prepare for, right? If we're dealing with 4, 5, 6 patients, well, we can't fit every single person into the ambulance, right? It's just not totally feasible, but it is something where maybe we do have to get extra resources going. So this is the type of call where you need to get ahead of things a little bit and figure out what you need and what you don't, okay? Now, all of this is going to be under the ICS, or Incident Command System, okay, which is the whole goal of this is to do the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. Unfortunately, when we talk about mass casualty incidents, it's not always going to go well for everybody. It's just the harsh reality of this. But that said, we are going to do the best we can for as many as we can. And then part of this is also, this is all put on by NIMS, so the National Incident Management System. So it promotes efficient coordination of emergency incidents at the regional, state, and national levels. Okay, so NIMS, implemented in 2004, gives us the framework to enable federal, state, and local governments to work together. So it allows us to kind of create a standard language, for lack of a better term, for all of us to communicate across the board, right? Because these incidents, when they show up, it's kind of all hands on deck. So whoever's available is going to show up, so you never really know. Okay, so if we kind of have this baseline communication model, we can be more effective and more efficient. Now this also includes the private sector as well as non-governmental organizations. Now the organizational structure of NIMS is flexible enough to be rapidly adaptable, okay? Once again, these are the type of situations that go sideways very, very quickly, okay? You need to adapt. This is the kind of thing where they don't always go according to plan, okay? So provide standardization and terminology, our resource classification, personnel training, and certification, okay? So major NIMS components, communication and information management is going to be a huge one. A lot of this chapter is diving and delving into communication. We need to be able to communicate effectively for these scenarios to go, or excuse me, these calls to go exactly how we want, or at least as close to what we want to look like. Okay, another part of that, resource management, and then command and management as well. And we'll delve into those as we kind of progress. So, Incident Command System, ICS. So, also sometimes referred to as the Incident Management System. But what is the purpose of ICS? Well, ensures the responders and public safety, right? Making sure everyone's somewhat on the same page so that for the responders, we can take care of ourselves as well as stop bystanders or the general public from adding to the fire, essentially. Helps us achieve incident management goals as well as ensure efficient use of our resources. Depending on the circumstance is going to dictate what resources we need. So it helps to control duplication of effort and freelancing, right? That way we don't have so many people kind of doing their own thing. We need people to be structured, or our responders to be structured when we work through. So this kind of helps get rid of that to a degree. It also limits the span of control. If you've ever heard the phrase, too many cooks in the kitchen, right? That kind of thing can start to show up in MCIs. If we have 4 or 5 people who want to be in charge, even 2 to 3 people who want to be in charge, things can tend to get a little kerfuffled, okay? Under ICS, we have 1 supervisor for up to 3 to 7 workers. Now, depending on the depth of the incident, will dictate how many more people we will need, and then you'll kind of see as we progress that command structure. Now, those organizational levels include sections, branches, divisions, and groups, okay? So operations, planning, logistics, and financing. Those are going to be the top there, okay? And we have our branch, and then division or group, division or group, division or group, division or group. So everything is kind of a flow chart down, right? With the pinkish, tan pinkish boxes here being the kind of the leadership, okay? So the roles and responsibilities, right? So command, finance, logistics, operations, planning, command, staff, they all have their own role. And we'll talk more about some of them here in a moment. But each one needs to have its own kind of lane, because once again, we don't want too many cooks in the kitchen. We don't want too many people trying to take control of an already stressful situation and causing some miscommunication, which inevitably can hurt our patient outcomes, okay? So command, this is a big one. Our IC, or incident commander, is in charge of the overall incident, okay? When we have a mass casualty, it's important to get an incident commander early. Now, this is also a very stressful role. This is something where usually we want the most senior person with the most experience in these to operate as the IC, but it's not always feasible, right? Sometimes if you're an ambulance crew and you've got a mass casualty, let's say a 4 or 5 car pileup, and there's multiple patients, someone's got to be command, okay? We can always give command to a more senior person when they arrive, and we'll talk about that in a moment, okay? Now, it's important to know who the IC is, how to communicate with them, and where their post is located, right? They need to be kind of away from the action a little bit so that they can strategize a little bit, okay? And then an IC may turn over command to someone with more experience in a critical area. Yeah. If there's somebody who has ran mass casualties as an IC before, they're likely the person that we want to continue doing this, okay? Not because us as providers, ground level providers are not capable, but more so it's a comfort thing, as well as the fact that these are stressful. And if someone's done this before, they got a little bit of experience in it, that's gonna go a lot further than brand new EMT, paramedic, whoever getting on scene and trying to run this. For finance, they're going to be responsible for documenting all expenditures at an incident for reimbursement. This is kind of away from the field staff a little bit. This is pretty low on our concern list because obviously we're dealing with the patients in front of us. Then we have logistics, so responsible for communications equipment, facilities, food and water, fuel, lighting, medical equipment, supplies. What do we need? Now, logistics may or may not show up to this incident depending on the severity, depending on what it is. Okay, if we're talking more of like a low-level, motor vehicle collision, multi-car crash, that's going to look a little different, right? So usually that's where logistics will have the ambulances prepped prior, just like every normal shift, in hopes that we have enough things, even with our backups, to at least help as many people as we can. Operations, so at a very large or complex incident, they're responsible for managing the tactical operations, usually handled by the incident commander, okay? Depending on the size of the incident. We might have somebody step in top down, and they will kind of run it. And we'll show you I'll explain the tiered system here in a bit. This also supervises the people working at the scene, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, once again, working for the greater good. Planning helps solve the problems as they arise, as well as give it an action plan. We want to know what we're going to be doing. If things go sideways, what's plan B, C, D, so on and so forth. And lastly, our command staff. Okay, so the safety officer monitors the scene for conditions or operations that may present a hazard. You might also have your PIO or your public information officer show up. A big part of what they're going to have to do is kind of keep media clear, okay? They keep them out of the incident, but also make sure that they are able to understand the information as needed, okay? And then the liaison officer relays information and concerns among command and the general staff, as well as other agencies. This is where the idea of mutual aid can also start to show up. So say you work for a 911 county system, there may be a mutual aid request, so the adjacent county, they may need to send responders or apparatus or whatever to help out with the incident, depending on where it's at. Okay, if it's kind of on that borderline or it's just into another county, it's definitely worth your while, if it's going to be a mass casualty, to get as many hands and apparatus involved as possible. Okay, now when it comes to these incidents, like I said, very, very stressful. Historically, communication has been one of the major weak points. One of the biggest weak points because things happen fast. And especially when we start having really critical stuff start to show up, our patients are presenting very poorly, that kind of changes things, right? And people start getting into this tunnel vision a little bit of, okay, here's my patient, I gotta take care of my patient, right? And so they aren't communicating as effectively as they possibly could because they're kind of distracted, right? For the right reasons. Regardless, they need to try and hone that in, okay? So it's recommended that communications be integrated. So all agencies should be able to communicate quickly and effortlessly via radios. I will say, especially in MCIs, if you can talk to someone face to face, like if you have to talk to incident command, it might help if it's a major incident and there's a lot of radio chatter going on over and over and over. Keep those radio lanes clear, okay? We want to keep that radio traffic to a minimum, so even when you do need to talk on the radio, short, sweet, concise, repeated phrasing, okay? That way we're not missing anything. And then communication also allows for accountability and instant communication. So for mobilization and deployment, so check in with your incident commander when you arrive. So we are dispatched to a 4-car crash, okay? There's an incident commander already on scene. When our apparatus shows up, we will find incident command and we will talk to him. What is going on? Where do you want me? Okay? Now, depending on the size of the incident, there could also be additional supervisors. So you'll have your incident commander, and then a level below them will be the supervisor. So you might have someone supervising the medical side, someone supervising the hazmat side if needed. It really just depends, but that's where that structure will start settling. And the record keeping allows for tracking of time spent on the actual incident for reimbursement purposes as needed. Once again, that's kind of above my pay grade even. Even as the paramedic on scene, this was not something I was thinking about. Now, accountability means keeping your supervisor advised of your location, actions, and completed tasks. Hey, we are going to this patient in that vehicle. Okay, I'm going to be getting them out. Once we have them out and we are ready to start transport, I need to let them know we have patient out. We are going to be transporting now. Okay, they may decide that they're going to reallocate that situation, but that's up to them at that point. Okay, but you need to make sure your supervisor is in tune with what you're doing, especially if you're going to be leaving. We don't want just ambulances and fire engines taking off, right? And then we, as a supervisor or the incident commander is like, hey, can we get that rig over there? And it's gone, obviously things start to change. So make sure you're keeping communication channels open. Then once the incident has been stabilized, the incident commander will determine which resources are needed and when to begin demobilization. Okay, when can we break down the scenario? When can we break down the call? We've got the people out that need to be out, or so on and so forth. Okay, so for EMS response within ICS, some different factors, okay? Preparedness involves the decisions made and basic planning done before the incident occurs. Okay, what happened? What can we do to get ahead of this? Involves decisions and planning about the most likely natural disasters for the area. Based on what we're seeing, based on what happened, this is not a safe section of road. This is not a safe section of land if we're maybe in the mountains or close to a river or by the ocean, right? There's so many different things. So they have to look past that a little bit. Where can we find areas where we can plan around, knowing that there's potential for that to kind of cause headaches during this. And then your EMS agency should have written disaster plans that you are regularly trained to carry out. Yeah, follow your protocols. Worst case scenario, you can always lean into your protocols, but this is something that you need to be trained on fairly frequently, and a lot of agencies will do so. Now, big thing for scene size up. This is going to be both for incident commander, but even as like the field staff, right? If you're an EMT on scene, make your initial assessment and some preliminary decisions, okay? Now, the 3 basic questions that drive that: what do I have in front of me? What do I need? What am I going to need to do to take care of this, okay? You've got to be asking yourself those things. Identification quickly is going to help you. The quicker you identify, the quicker you know what equipment you'll need. The sooner you know what equipment you'll need, you'll know what actions to take with said equipment. Right, so potential mass casualty ambulances. Depending on where you work, where you live, they may have those. They may roll these out as needed as well. For establishing command. Command should be established by the most senior official. Okay, on scene, once again, you can always, if there's going to be a more senior person, say a chief of some variety showing up, They may take over incident command once they arrive on scene. Notification to other responders should go out. Necessary resources should be requested, and the command must be established early. The sooner we get command established, the sooner we can start divvying out the apparatus and responders the way we need them. And once again, communication. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If possible, use face-to-face communication. Let's limit radio traffic, okay? If you're going to communicate on the radio, first of all, we don't use 10 codes or signals, right? We're not going to be saying like our 5250s or 10100s or anything like that, okay? They're going to be talking in plain speech so everyone knows what is going on. Once again, limiting our traffic so it's not, hogging the airwaves essentially. The equipment must be reliable, durable, and field tested. Most of that's going to be done well before the incident. And then make sure there are backups in place, okay? The typical apparatus will have a plan A, plan B for for equipment as needed, right? So for example, most ambulances are gonna have at least 2 BVMs sitting around, right, or on the rig, maybe upwards of 3 to 4, depending on the size and depending on where you work. Okay, so the medical branch. Now this is where the EMT kind of really steps in, right? We are not, as a new EMT, we're not gonna be taking command, and we're not gonna be, or at least we're not gonna be maintaining command. Okay, we're gonna fall under this medical care. Now, Medical Incident Command is also known as the medical branch or EMS branch of the incident command system, with the big preliminary roles being triage, treatment, and transport of our injured folks. Now we'll talk about a couple of different triage methods that are out there. And just for full disclosure and honesty, I wrote them out because I want to make sure that I'm giving that information to you as appropriately as possible. Okay, so triage, treat, transport. Okay, that's going to be our order of events, okay, for the EMS branch. We got to make sure, so triage, what do we have in front of us? What do we need to treat? Who needs to be transported? So the triage supervisor, okay, typically we'll talk about hot, warm, and cold zones in a little bit, but they're going to be away from the action, right? We want to keep our injured or sick folk away from the incident that caused them to be injured or sick folk. Okay, so, but the triage supervisor, in charge of counting and prioritizing the patients. They also help ensure every patient receives initial assessment of their condition, right? Let's see what we've got. Let's make sure we're not missing anything off the rip, essentially, but we see it quickly. And then do not begin treatment until all patients are triaged. This is gonna be for that treatment zone, but it's also one of those where we gotta see who needs to go sooner or later. Now the treatment supervisor locates and sets up the treatment area with a tier for each priority of patient. Okay, and we'll talk about priorities, but red, yellow, green, black are gonna be the ones we're gonna talk about. And then they also ensure that secondary triage is performed and that the adequate patient care is given, right? We've got the right person triaged the right way. We are providing the correct treatment so that we can get them moving to the hospital via transport or maybe treat and release as needed. And then they also assist with moving patients to the transport area. The transportation supervisor, which before I go too far as well, this is going to be for a very big incident. Almost even think like an Asher or an active shooter scenario where there's going to be multiple victims. Okay, this is going to be someone whose whole job is divvying out who goes when and at what time. So they coordinate the transportation and distribution of patients to the right hospital. We want to make sure we're sending folks to the right place depending on the need they have. And then document and tracks the number of transport vehicles, patients transported, and the facility destination, right? How many total vehicles do we have? They want to keep a running tally on that so that if we need to continue to move people out, we always have one, at least one available for what we need, okay? And then how many people have we shipped off, okay? Because if we have a total of 40 patients, making something crazy up, right? Total of 40 patients, that might be something where we got to keep tabs on how many patients we have left and how many more apparatus we'll need coming in, as well as where we're sending them. Now the staging supervisor should be assigned when scenes requiring multi-vehicle or multi-agency response. Once again, this is where that mutual aid can also start showing up. Now emergency vehicles must have permission to enter the scene and only drive in the directed area. That's going to be a big one. And that's actually a big focus when it comes to a lot of these ICS type scenarios. Where are we going to be bringing the apparatus that's taking people to the hospital We want to make sure that we are not creating more of a problem or a traffic jam, and we have an in and an out, or egress, degress, okay? And then the staging area should be established away from the scene so we can keep things as clear as possible, right? Bodies take up room, so if we can start divvying that out a little bit and spreading the net a little wider, it'll help. If there is a physician on scene, not always, but if there is one, they're going to be there for the difficult triage decisions. They're going to be the final yes or no, we're taking them now or later. They also provide secondary triage decisions and treatment area, as well as provide on-scene medical direction for EMTs. That way, if we have to deviate from scope for whatever reason, and we have the resources as well as the equipment necessary, they can allow you to breach scope as needed. As well as provide care in the treatment sector as appropriate if they have the time, if they have the freedom to do so in the moment. You'll also have a rehab supervisor. So establishes an area that provides protection from the elements as well as the situation. They're also going to be meeting responder needs. So fluids, food, protection from elements, right? We want to make sure that we have somebody that can take care of the responders so we can get them kind of just patched up, give them a water break for lack of a better description, and then send them back out and do what they need to do. Okay, they also monitor responders for signs of stress, right? End of the day, we do care about the responders who are on these incidents, and we need to make sure they're doing well, because if they're not, they may potentially just add to the pile of patients we have. Okay? Once again, depending on the scenario, but extrication and special rescue, right? They're going to be there to determine the type of equipment and resources we might need for this situation, depending on the circumstance, depending on the team needed. It will usually function under the EMS branch of the incident command system. Okay, and then last, the morgue supervisor. Okay, so works with area medical examiners, coroners, disaster mortuary assistance teams, and law enforcement agencies to coordinate removal of bodies and body parts. Right, if there's going to be dead, which happens in MCIs. Right, if there's going to be people who are dead, it's going to be one of those things where we, as responders, can't really waste our time because we can attribute our time to someone else who we can help a little sooner. This is going to be where they come in and getting those bodies out. Okay, now the morgue area should be out of view of the living patients and other responders. Keep it pretty isolated, right? This is outside of medical care goes. Keeping it away from the patients and responders is more, it's kind of a morale thing. It's good for their mental. Okay, it's one of those where let's not just show them a bunch of dead bodies. They just went through something very traumatic and they're going to be living this in their mind for many, many moons. Okay, so let's just make it a little easier on their head, a little headspace. Okay, so MCIs moving forward. Involve 3 or more patients. Puts great demand on the EMS system, right? Because we're going to have to be allocating resources to this, which means that we might have openings in other places. So don't be surprised either. This is the kind of scenario where maybe they page out and they bring people who are off duty to come and man an apparatus, right? Get on an ambulance, get on a fire engine, and run the calls in the normal area, the regular calls they would be running anyway, because those other resources are going to be at the MCI. And also know there's the potential to produce multiple casualties, right? MCI means there's potentially more than one patient, more than 3. Now, all systems are going to have different protocols for when to declare an MCI and initiate the ICS, so follow your protocols locally. Now, you and your team cannot treat and transport all injured and sick at the same time. Yeah, you can only deal with what's in front of you, right? And if you're trying to cast a wide net and take care of everyone, the reality is you're probably shortchanging somebody who you could have helped had you been focused in on the one at a time. I understand this, the situation and the circumstances will differ, but that's kind of the reality of it. Now, never leave the scene with patients if there are still other patients who are sick and wounded, unless you have one of those supervisors telling you, right? They've got it coordinated, they know what we need, they know what we have incoming, you can go, okay? But leave that up to them. You don't make a lot of decisions when we're in the ICS moments. Command is going to be telling you when and where you're going, okay? Now, if there are multiple patients and not enough resources to handle them, without abandoning victims, you should declare an MCI, request additional resources, and then get ICS going. So if you are a single unit ambulance responding to a motor vehicle collision that turns out to be multiple vehicles with more than 3 patients, okay, we're not just taking the one patient who was called for. If that was the case, okay, we're gonna get everyone else here as fast as we can, or at least declare an MCI and get that rolling. Okay, let's talk about triage. Now, I already said earlier, I wrote some of these things down, so I'll be reading from a list here in a little bit. Stay with me on it, okay? But triage means to sort, okay? So we're sorting them based on the severity of their injuries. When you're triaging, assessments should be brief, and patient conditions categories are basic, right? We want to make sure that we're looking at the ABCs essentially. Is there something that's showing me this person's going to die in the next 5 to 10 minutes? That's going to change us, or change our priority a little bit. Now, primary triage is done in the field, with secondary triage is being done on patients as they're brought to the treatment area, okay? So primary is our quick, down and dirty, ABC, life threats. Well, okay, based on this, I'm seeing them tagged as a yellow or a red. Get them moved to the triage. They'll second opinion. We'll get moving from there. They'll coordinate with transport. Now, once again, I kind of talked about it, but the 4 common categories we give for treatment and transport is immediate, so we're going to tag them as red. We have a delayed, which is yellow. Minor or minimal, which is green, okay, or maybe we hold them in the triage area. And then expectant being black, or likely to die or dead, okay? Once again, this is where mass casualties kind of do a disservice, because yes, there may be circumstances where there's a person we could make a difference for, we could help, but if we have 9 other people around them, it's going to be tough, and they're going to require a lot of the equipment and personnel we have. So we're going to have to make some hard choices. Okay? No one loves this, but it is a reality. Okay. Now, these tags usually come with a triage kit, so you can see here they're kind of like they're not really a tape, they're like a thin plastic. Okay, but tagging patients early assists in tracking them and can help keep an accurate record of their condition. Now, these tags need to be weatherproof, easily read, and color coded. So usually what will happen is we'll tie one of these colors based on what they are around the arm or somewhere visible that it's going to be an immediate, oh, I see that's a green, yellow, red, black, okay? Now, depending on the circumstances, usually in the triage area, they will fill out these forms, okay? We'll give a report to the person in the triage area. This is what we see. They will fill out that little triage tag, and they will leave that with the patient. That way, as they're walking by, they can look at it and say, okay, we have time, nope, you need to go now, okay? Okay, so start triage. Simple triage, rapid treatment, okay? Now, first step, call out to the patient and direct them to an easily identifiable landmark, okay? Injured persons are the walking wounded. So this is something where we show up, there's chaos going on, we're the first to arrive, command's a minute behind us. Okay, we know we need to set up ICS, so this is where we're gonna stand away from the incident and we're gonna yell as loud as we can. If you can walk to me, I need you to walk to me. If they are able to ambulate towards you, okay, we are likely gonna tag them as green, depending, right? Can't kind of say it all necessarily, mostly because sometimes yellows, say someone has a broken leg, they might try and limp their way to you. That might still be kind of in that delayed, they need treatment, but we can wait a little bit, they're not life-threatening. Now the second step is directed towards non-walking patients. So once we have all the greens out of there, we have now kind of left the remainders that we can go through and start triaging out. From there, we will go and assess them based on respiratory rate, hemodynamic status, and neurologic status. Okay, so for start triage. So, first step, once again, calling is performed on arrival, calling out to patients at the disaster site, directing them to an easily identifiable landmark. The injured persons are going to be marked as walking wounded and are considered minimal priority or third priority. The second step is towards non-walking, right? So now we start walking our way out. We move to the first non-ambulatory patient and assess their respiratory status. So the first person you see in front of you, that's the one you're going to stop at. Okay, if that patient is not breathing, we're going to open their airway using a simple maneuver. So either a head tilt chin lift or a jaw thrust. Okay? If after we open the airway, the patient does not begin to breathe, we are going to triage them as expectant. Okay, they're going to be tagged as a black. We can always come back to them. Okay, remember that. But immediately we're going to tag them as a black. If that patient begins to breathe, we're going to tag them as an immediate red, place the patient in the recovery position, and move to the next patient. Okay, we've tagged it, we're moving on. Let's get all of our ducks in a row before we start pulling people out. Okay. If a patient is breathing faster than 30 breaths a minute or less than 10 breaths a minute, they're also tagged as a red, as immediate priority. If the patient is breathing from 10 to 29 breaths a minute, we're going to move to the next step. Okay, so the next step, assess the hemodynamic status of the patient by checking for bilateral radial pulses. An absent pulse implies the patient is likely hypotensive. Once again, we are going to tag them as a red. Our last assessment there is to assess the patient's neurologic status by assessing the patient's ability to follow commands. If they're unconscious or cannot follow simple commands, once again, we mark them as a red. I will make sure that this sheet, to some degree, is included so you can take a look at this probably in the comment section. Now, peds are a little different. We're going to use something called jump start triage. Okay, so it's a little different and it has to do with respiratory because kids are breathers. Okay, think about cardiac arrest. Kids tend to go into respiratory arrest with cardiac arrest following. Inversely, adults is cardiac arrest with respiratory arrest following. So, jump start intended for use in children younger than 8 who appear to weigh less than 100 pounds. So, same thing, start by identifying our walking wounded. Okay. Now, several differences within the respiratory status is part of the start, and I'll go through that here in the end. And then assess the approximate rate of respirations, hemodynamic status, neurologic status. Not a lot of big changes when we think theoretically. Where it starts to change is when we start to assess the respiratory, okay? So identify our walking wounded, right? Now, if it's infants or children not developed enough to walk or follow commands, including kids with special needs, should be taken as soon as possible to the treatment sector for immediate secondary triage. Let's get them moved, let's put them in front of the secondary triage. They can start divvying out resources there. Now, if we find a pediatric patient not breathing, immediately check a pulse, right? Remember, depending on the size of the kid, it's going to dictate the pulse point, right? If it's going to be like a toddler or even a child, a pretty small child, we're going to go brachial, okay? So we obviously want to get to the carotid or central pulse quicker. Depending on the patient, we may not have as much access. Now, if there is no pulse, that patient is going to be labeled as a black, okay? If the patient is not breathing but has a pulse, open the airway, once again with a manual maneuver, so head tilt, chin lift, jaw thrust, depending on the circumstance, okay? Remember with pediatrics, this is where we kind of got a tough one if there's trauma involved, okay? But we got to pad their shoulders to make sure that airway is open. Let's accommodate for that larger occiput, so let's bring the shoulders forward, head back a little bit, instead of having their big head pushed down, okay? From there, the patient does not begin to breathe, 5 rescue breaths, check respirations again. If the child at that point does not begin to breathe, they're labeled as expectant, they're black tagged, okay? Now from there, we gotta move into the approximate rate. We open up, or we give them the 5 breaths, they begin to breathe again. Let's get a rate of respirations, let's start moving hemodynamics, moving to, okay? So assess the pulse, okay? Especially just make sure it's the one you feel most competent and confident in finding, especially on peds. I heavily recommend, if you have not, spend some time practicing. If you have children, you can practice pulses on, okay? If there's an absence of distal pulse, label the child as an immediate priority, move to the next patient. Okay, and the final assessment's neurologic. Now, going back to that last red, if we think about it, right, if they're breathing, they have a absent or weak pulse, we can potentially get that pulse rate up. Oftentimes our treatment for that is just going to be oxygen in kids. They're breathers. They need oxygen because they have a high oxygen demand. Okay, but digress, moving forward. Final assessment is going to be our neurologic. Okay, so use a modified ABPU, make it appropriate, right? And a child who is unresponsive or responds to pain by posturing or with incomprehensible sounds or is unable to localize pain is tagged once again as an immediate or a red patient. Okay, so that's kind of the down and dirty with the triage. It's something that I recommend spending some time in, be familiar with, okay? If you work for an agency or you're going to work for an agency, double check your protocols, see if there's anything for MCIs. Now, some special considerations. Patients who are hysterical and disruptive to rescue efforts may need to be handled as an immediate priority. More so, let's just get them out of the situation. And if we think about an MCI, I almost promise you people are not gonna be just a chill dude, right? They're gonna have some issues, Okay, so make sure you just get them away from there, because if they're climbing and grabbing on you as you're trying to do other things, that's only inhibiting you from helping more people. Get them moved to the secondary triage, let them deal with it, okay? Responder who becomes sick or injured during the rescue effort should be handled as an immediate. We look after our own, and obviously we want as many responders possible in an MCI available to help. If they are not available to help, we can't do as much good as we want, okay? So they are often flagged as a red pretty quickly. And then identify patients as contaminated or decontaminated in hazmat incidents, depending on the circumstance. Now the destination decision, once again, is going to be part of the triage group, and then the transportation supervisor will look at that. But all patients triaged as immediate or delayed should be transported by ground or air ambulance. If it's a large situation and it's a bunch of green patients, you can use buses. Let's just get that bus moving, okay? Immediate priority patients should be transported 2 at a time until we are transported, all are transported from the site. Kind of the way it works is if it's red, we can take 2. Let's take 2 people in the ambulance at a time. And then when it comes to the yellows, kind of the same thing. And when it comes to greens, you can take 3 to 4 at a time. Just make sure you have the proper charting to follow that, as well as the appropriate amount of providers. Okay, and then patients in the delayed category can be transported 2 or 3 at a time. Finally, the slightly injured are transported. Now, expectant patients who are still alive would receive treatment and transport last, right? So we get all our reds out, we get all our yellows out, the greens are finally going. Let's double check the black tags. Is there anybody that we can still help out, okay? Dead victims are going to be handled or transporting according to the special operations for the area, okay? So disaster management. Disaster is widespread, right? So it disrupts the functions and resources of the community, and disaster is a pretty wide definition, so there's a lot of that kind of thing out there, so it depends on the circumstance, but can threaten lives and properties. Now, many disasters may not involve personal injuries, but many disasters like flood, fires, hurricanes result in widespread injuries. It really just depends on the circumstances. Now, your role is to respond when requested and report to the incident commander for assigned tasks. A casualty collection area may be established in a disaster with an overwhelming number of casualties. Yeah, they're going to try and get them kind of separated out and putting them in their own space so that we can just get them moving as kind of well-oiled as we can. Now, coordinated through the ICS in the same way as all other branches and areas of the operation. Moving forward, so hazmat. Now, when you arrive at a hospital, or excuse me, when you arrive at a possible hazmat incident, your first step, back and assess the situation, okay? Let's take a look, let's look at everything, okay? When we're talking hazmat, we can't always see what the issue is, right? It's like a gas, can't see that, but it could be potentially dangerous, okay? Rushing into unsafe scenes can be catastrophic, and if you overcome, you'll be unable to, or if you're overcome, you'll be unable to assist patients, okay? Now there's a few different type of approaches. Typically when it comes to approaches to a potential hazmat situation, the typical verbiage is uphill and upwind, right? We don't want that stuff blowing towards us. And then if you have them, use binoculars, take a look and see what we got. This might be another one where we have to call in a specialized hazmat resource, okay? So, according to the HazWalker, first responders at the awareness level should have sufficient training or experience to demonstrate the following competencies: an understanding of what the hazardous substances are and the risk associated with them, and then an understanding of the potential outcomes of an incident. Now, I'm not going to front and pretend like I know every single thing out there when it comes to these potential hazmats, because I don't, right? It's a pretty long list. This is where we'll talk about it. Things like placards are going to come in handy, and there are guides to helping you understand what placards are going to mean. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, areas of training or experience. The ability to recognize the presence of a hazardous substance is going to be important. The ability to identify the hazardous substance, if possible, is going to be important. An understanding of the role of the first responder awareness individual, right? We got to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in danger, and that we can kind of start an MCI, or excuse me, a casualty triage, or at least get a count fairly quickly, even from a distance. And then the ability to determine the need for additional resources and to notify the communication center. So, let's get into the recognizing. A hazardous material poses an unreasonable risk of damage or injury if it's not properly controlled during either handling, storage, manufacturing, processing, packing, use and disposal, and transportation, okay? Look at the whole thing. Take a step back, look at the big picture. What all is involved here, and based on what I'm seeing, what is going to be a problem starter, okay? Identify the critical visual indicators as well. So hazardous materials may be involved in any of the following situations. So trucks or train crash in which a substance is leaking from the tank truck or tank car. A leak, fire, or other emergency in an industrial plant, refinery, or complex. And then leak or rupture of an underground natural gas pipe. Those are just some examples. There are plenty of others, I'm sure, out there. Okay. Maybe even deterioration of an underground fuel tank, right? Seepage of oil or gasoline into the ground. Maybe we have buildup of methane or other byproducts, right? Waste decomposition in sewers, so things like fire, flammable, and explosions, potential. Motor vehicle crashes resulting in a ruptured gas tank. Okay, so here's kind of some images, right? You can see on the left we've got a leak underground there on the left side. On the right side we have, looks like a tanker truck was hit by a bus, right? Both of them are going to be problematic in different ways. Uphill, upwind, as best you can. Occupancy and location. So a wide variety of materials are stored in locations such as warehouses, hospitals and labs, industrial complexes, residential garages, bowling alleys, home improvement and garden centers, as well as restaurants, okay? And when it comes to using your senses, right, if we're gonna go by smell, that's probably not a great one. If there's something toxic in the air and I'm walking by sniffing, 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 I'm putting myself in danger. So use things like sight and sound. Use your eyes, use your ears, pay attention, okay? Using any of your senses that bring you in close proximity to the chemical should be done with caution or avoided, right? We don't want to walk in when we're smelling or tasting things. Don't lick stuff on scene. Trust me, it's not worth your time. Now, clues that are seen or heard from a distance may also enable you to take precautionary steps. Okay, so now we'll talk about some of the containers that we might see some of these hazardous materials in, and just more so as like a brief awareness for you. So a container is any vessel or receptacle that holds a material, right? So often the container type, size, and material of construction provide important clues about the nature of the substance inside, which there's two categories. Is this a bulk container or a non-bulk container? Is there a lot of this substance or a little of this substance? So container volume. Bulk storage containers are found in buildings that rely on and need to store large quantities of a particular chemical. So these containers are often surrounded by secondary containment systems to help control any accidental release. That's their contingency plan. Something went wrong with plan A, we now have plan B to help stop. Okay, now large volume horizontal tanks are also a common thing. Totes, we'll show some images here, but totes have capacities ranging from 119 to 703 gallons of material. It can contain any type of chemical, including flammable liquids, corrosives, food-grade liquids, or oxidizers, and these will typically not have a secondary containment system. All right, so here you go. Here's your totes. Now, intermodal tanks are both shipping and storage vessels as well, and these can hold anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 gallons, and can be pressurized or non-pressurized. Okay, so your larger tanks. Intermodal tank. Now, non-bulk storage vessels, right? So hold commonly used commercial and industrial chemicals. These are either done in drums, right? So they're recognizable, they kind of look like barrels. Sometimes they're like a blue color, just depends on manufacturer of that drum. Then generally the nature of the chemical dictates the construction of the drum. Now, bags are commonly used to store solids and powders, may be constructed of plastic paper or plastic lined paper. So pesticide bags, be an example, but must be labeled with specific information as well. Carboys transport and store the corrosives and other types of chemicals. So glass, plastic, or steel containers that can hold 5 to 15 gallons of product, often placed in protected wood, foam, fiberglass, or steel boxes. Okay, just dependent on what type of substance they're holding. Okay, so here's your carboy for corrosives on this guy. And then our non-bulk, right? So uninsulated compressed gas cylinders used to store substances such as nitrogen, argon, helium, and oxygen. So think your tanks, right? So that's where hospitals, even ambulances to a degree, right? Depending on how many tanks they have on there. Okay, the marking system, the placards. So labels, placards, and other markings are used on buildings, packages, boxes, containers. Okay, with the marking system indicating the presence of a hazardous material from a safe distance, as well as providing clues about the substance. So this is kind of the general list of some placards here. Okay, each one of these placards has a very specific meaning. It means that this is the type of substance I'm holding, right? This is a flammable, this is a toxic substance if inhaled, right? Things along that nature. This is a big long list. And I know as EMTs, we have a big long list of things we have to remember, kind of a baseline. So to help you out, there are books, which we will talk about here in a moment. But the placards are diamond-shaped indicators, usually on all four sides of the transport vehicle, so we can identify from whichever angle we see. Now, labels are smaller versions of placards, okay, placed on four sides of individual boxes in smaller packages. Now, if we're talking about transport vehicles, and we're talking about maybe like that scenario where the tanker truck was hit by the bus, right? Depending on the damage to the tank, you might not be able to see one of the placards. This is where trying to get as much of a visual around it as possible is going to help you out, okay? So here's an example of some placards. Diamond shaped, all sides of the transport vehicle. Now the DOT, and then there is let's see, yeah, right here. So we'll talk about the references here in a moment. So the DOT, Department of Transportation system, does not require that all chemical shipments be marked, okay, depending on the need to know of it. But in most cases, the package or cargo tank must contain a certain amount of hazardous material before the placard is required. Okay, so remember, when we talk tox, dose makes the poison, kind of the same idea. Depending on how much is carried is going to dictate how lethal or not it is. Now, some chemicals are so hazardous that shipping any amount requires the use of labels or placards, right? Think about like radioactive substances. You don't need a whole lot to be a problem. So that's going to be marked pretty quick. So this is a good one, the Emergency Response Guidebook, right? So it offers a certain amount of guidance for responders operating on a hazmat, and it provides information on approximately 4,000 chemicals. I believe they have an app too, okay? So you can throw that on your phone. I'm old, I used to keep this book in my pocket from time to time. But keep that in mind, there is an app so you can have this readily available, and it can help you identify what you're kind of getting yourself into. Material safety data sheets. Common source of information about a particular chemical, right? It usually is going to be producible by whoever's transporting it or whoever's in charge of that hazmat or hazardous material. So it provides basic info, it's chemical makeup of the substance, potential hazards, what's the appropriate first aid if there's an exposure, and as well as safe handling data. For shipping papers required whenever materials are transported from one place to another, so names and addresses of the shipper and receiver, identifier of the material being shipped, and specify the quantity and weight of each part. And then lastly, Chemical Transportation Emergency Center, Chemtrec, operated by the American Chemistry Council, serves as an invaluable technical information resource for first responders of all disciplines who are called upon to respond to chemical incidents. Okay, so identification, kind of kicking this horse a little bit, but it's one of those things, right? We just gotta be good at it to the best of our degree, not only for our patients, but for ourselves. So despite the availability of resources, identification can still be difficult, okay? So following might help you. Is there a visible cloud or strange looking smoke escaping from the substance? Are there any fumes coming off? Is the leak or spill from a tank, container truck, or railroad car? And then is there an unusually strong, noxious, meaning kind of irritating or bad, harsh odor in the area, right? Now, obviously, we don't tend to want to be close enough to smell these things, but sometimes if it's a gas that's going to escape everywhere, you might notice an odor. If any signs suggest that a hazmat incident has occurred, stop at a safe distance, park upwind or uphill, or both. Ideally, both, whatever you can do. Now call for the hazmat team to try to rapidly assess the situation and try to provide as much info as possible, okay? Let hazmat do what hazmat does. They are specifically trained in how to handle a lot of these things as well as how to decon as needed. Now, if you do not re-enter the scene and do not leave the area until you've been cleared, depending on the substance, you might need to be decontaminated, because now if we bring all of our decontaminated cells to the hospital, we are running the risk of contaminating lots of folks, okay? So avoid all contact. Generally, I feel like that's just kind of duh, right? But avoid all contact with the material, just especially if you're unsure, okay? So hazmat scene operations, use the ambulance's public address system, or PAs, right? You can talk into that and let the surroundings know, right? So alert individuals near the scene, tell them to move away, upwind, uphill ideally. Establish control zones, so securing access to help ensures that no one will accidentally enter the contaminated area. Yeah, zone it off. We don't want access, right? If once again, thinking back to that bus versus cargo, or excuse me, shipping truck, tanker truck. They have that all marked off in police tape, right? Don't go near this. Yeah, mark it off. Establish your control zone. So we'll talk about hot, warm, and cold here in a moment. So you should be prepared to expand or contract the control zones as necessary, and I'll explain what these mean. But hot zone is typically where the issue is occurring. The warm zone is where we'll decon, and the cold zone is where incident commander as well as the command post lives. If we need a triage and transport section as well of the ICS, that's where to live, is in the cold zone away from the action. Okay, so the hot zone, area immediately surrounding the release, with most contaminated area being present around the area, right, where the thing is. And then all personnel must have decontaminated when they leave the hot zone. They need to be wearing specific equipment as well, non-permeable suits, essentially. And then they'll have to have an SCBA or a breathing mask on, think your firefighter masks, right? They're gonna have to have that on to some degree, just to make sure that we are not getting the responders sick while they're in there. The warm zone, where personnel and equipment transition into and out of the hot zone. Okay, we got to have our in-between space there. Okay, we need a little room to clean ourselves off before we get around to other folks. So it contains control points for access to the hot zone and decon area. And then decontamination, the process of removing or neutralizing and properly disposing of hazardous materials. So clean us off, get rid of what we need to get rid of in the appropriate manner. Okay, usually you'll have a hazmat coordinator on this. And then the cold zone, so this is our safe zone. Okay, we're close enough to the incident to be involved, far enough away where we're not getting hit by the hazardous material. It's a safe area where personnel do not need to wear any special protective clothing for safe operation. It also includes personnel staging, command posts, EMS providers, the area for medical monitoring, support, and or treatment after decon, right? We want it in the cold zone. We want it away from everything. That way we can start doing as much good for as many people as we possibly can with the given circumstance. So your role. The role of the EMT, job is to report to a designated area outside of the hot and warm zones, right? So we're gonna be on mostly the cold zone. Triage, treatment, transport, rehab. That's kind of your bread and butter there, okay? Identify what we have. What do I need to do to treat? Does this person need to be transported? Do we need to rehab our responders? NFPA 704 hazardous materials classification standard classifies hazardous materials according to a few different categories. Health hazard or toxicity levels, fire hazard, chemical reactive hazard, and special hazard, okay? Now these toxicity levels, there's 0 to 4 is going to be the ranking of it, 0 being very minor involvement, 4 being it doesn't take much and you're gonna die, okay? So it's gonna be kind of a scale, and there'll be a table here to kind of break that down. But measures the health risk that a substance poses to someone who comes into contact with it. The higher the number, the greater the toxicity. So here's our table. And so 0 through 4, 0 little to no hazard with no protection needed for the responder. 1 slightly hazardous, SCBA only. They just need to make sure they're not breathing it in. 2 slightly hazardous. We're gonna have SCBA only as well. 3 extremely hazardous, full protection with no exposed skin, so level A or B suit. And then level 4, minimal exposure can cause death. They're gonna need a specialized level A suit. We do not have any exposed skin. They're breathing tanked air, okay, making sure they have no contact with this substance. PPE. So PPE levels indicate the amount and type of protective gear that you need to prevent injury from the substance. So level A for our most hazardous substances requires fully encapsulated chemical resistant protective clothing that provides full body protection, once again, as well as the SCBA and special sealed equipment. This is where they literally will duct tape their pants to their boots, so there's nothing getting in between. Level B requires non-encapsulated protective clothing or clothing that's designed to protect against a particular hazard, depending on where it is and what it is. Now, it requires breathing devices that contain their own air supply, so once again, SCBA, as well as eye protection. Level C requires the use of non-permeable clothing and eye protection, face masks that filter all inhaled outside air. Okay, so you may have respirators on to some degree. And then level D requires a work uniform, such as coveralls that affords minimal protection. Regardless, all of these levels will require gloves. I would even extend, make sure you just put your eye pro on, you never know, right? You're wearing clear glasses, it's not like it's gonna impede you too much. Put them on, protect your eyes, protect your skin, protect yourself. And here's a breakdown, A, B, C, and D. Okay, so how do we care for these patients? It's practical only to provide the simplest assessment and essential care in the hazard zone and decon area because a few different things: dangers, time constraints, protective gear. The people who are wearing that level A suit, it's gonna be hard for them to move around and drag a bunch of people out of the space, right? So they're pretty limited by what they're even wearing, and that's a consideration you need to make, okay? Now, your care of the patients must address the following two issues. If it's trauma, any trauma that has resulted from other related mechanisms, such as vehicle collisions, fires, or explosions, okay? As well as the injury and harm that have resulted from exposure to the toxic or hazardous substance. Do we need, is it like a carbon monoxide? Let's get a bunch of oxygen on them, right, as an example. The most serious injuries and deaths from hazardous materials result from airway and breathing problems, people breathing in toxic substances. So in some cases, the hazmat team may find patients who need immediate treatment before decon area has been set up. So once again, as the more hazardous this material gets, you'll need to increase the amount of protective clothing you wear. So SCBA, 2 pairs of gloves, goggles or face shield, protective coat, respiratory protection for the responder, as well as a disposable fluid impervious apron. We don't want things going through our clothes and getting on our skin. Okay, so that is going to be the ICS chapter 40 in the 12th edition. If you have any questions, as always, leave a comment, like, subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.